After last episode, I went on a rather lengthy tangent about some things that were kind of loosely associated with the narrative, but not necessarily super connected to actual events that happened in the last episode. And while I think that the reaction portion should hopefully speak for itself in terms of my enjoyment of that episode, even if the after episode, post episode thoughts didn't necessarily, I do just kind of want to reiterate briefly before we get into this episode that I did greatly enjoy last episode. It was really freaking cool. The action was just really incredible to watch. And in particular, I do also just kind of want to highlight, I believe when we first saw kind of offensive magic being used by Frieren and Fern earlier on in the series, I was probably noticeably a little lukewarm on it. I don't think I outright called it bad, but I do think I probably said that it looked a little weird or different to me. And I do just want to kind of go ahead and say now that, like, I didn't really care for how it looked. But what we saw last episode with the way that Fern's magic looked in like a more involved combat against Lugner, that was sick. That was absolutely awesome. And yeah, so again, just kind of want to make it very abundantly clear that I thought last episode was really cool and that like there was a lot of cool stuff, action notwithstanding, but obviously the action itself was super standout in terms of just the quality of it in a number of different ways. So yeah, that now that that's out of the way, I just wanted to again just really make that. If it wasn't already super clear, I just wanted to make it even clearer. But with that being said, let's go ahead and now get into episode 10 of Frieren Beyond Journey's End, starting in 3, 2, 1, go. This looks like a flashback. We're in some random forest in the middle of the day. Ooh, it's a little loud too. Why does this episode feel louder than normal? Oh, yeah, we are definitely flashing back. She looks much younger. Nope, no idea who that is. Sounds like a name we might have heard once before, but oh, she doesn't. Oh. Okay, this is interesting. Oh, that's much more interesting, I feel. Huh, okay. That's certainly okay. So the first thing that was interesting was just the idea that we were getting to see the flashback where Flame did kind of impart her understanding of demons to Frieren, which is again like something that was something like we didn't really learn new information in that initial bit because it was just us hearing from Flame the things that Frieren had told us she had heard from Flame, right? So even though I thought it was interesting that we were seeing that, but the information itself was again just kind of we'd heard it before. But then that second part, that last bit about how if demons are unfair, we need to be even more unfair, and that like I don't mind like taking on this dishonor if it means being able to exterminate or eradicate. I don't remember exactly what the word, but it was some rather extreme word. It wasn't just like killing demons. I'm pretty sure it was some more extreme word being used. Um, and I think that's just kind of interesting because oftentimes like the sort of kind of standard noble hero sort of archetype that you see is all about like not becoming like the enemy, right? It's something that we've even seen a little bit of in Frieren, like when we had Frieren's flashback to Himmel and the demon child. Like the village chief didn't want to be like the demons, Himmel didn't want to be like the demons, and so to see Flame be like, "Oh no, I don't give a damn." That's interesting. Oh, he's still alive. Wild. I guess we didn't see him kind of disintegrate the way that Lenny did. Audio is all over the place this episode. Ah, yes, because I'm sure Freer needs protecting. I don't know if I believe you, to be quite honest. The facial expression change. Oh? Are they just concealing their their aura? Boom. That was a very. There were a number of reasons why I felt like that conversation was really cool. I might get into it after the episode. We'll see. To an extent, depends on what else happens. Oh, we've seen this before from a different angle. Oh, Demon Army's been around for a while. Okay, good. We're getting some bits of lore building this episode, world building this episode that I have been kind of desperate for in terms of just like filling in some of the blank spaces that have currently been left. Hmm. Interesting. So Frieren was a bit of a monster mage before even meeting Flame. That's cool to know. Happens. Oh, lovely. I'm sorry, what? Okay. More important information. More meaningful details. Painfully aware. That's an interesting phrase to use in that scenario. Okay. Yeah, so they underestimated her. Yep. All it takes is a momentary lapse in judgment to see yourself destroyed in battle. So you're telling me that in 1,000 years, almost 1,100 years, demons hadn't actually probably more than 1,100 years. Um, Based on what we know of various aspects of the timeline. Are you telling me that demons didn't realize that powerful human, or in some cases, elven mages don't know how to conceal their magical presence? Hmm. I love magic. That's not what she says in the present. This must be an exceedingly rare practice, I guess. Always. 'Yeah, rip him. His power was super cool. Good luck. 'I wonder. I mean, narratively, I understand why we got to this point, but practically speaking, in universe, I do sort of wonder why Frieren didn't just like blast her away shortly after arriving. 500 years is fairly long lived for a demon. Noting that down as well. They can't conceal their. Why? Elves can do it, humans can do it, but demons can't? Wow, we are getting lots of flashbacks this episode. And not one of Himmel. Oh, okay, we're addressing this. That's a big question. I don't know if that was meant to be insulting, but I thought it was kind of a fun insult. Interesting. Hmm. That's a weird statement. That. Hmm. I was gonna say, I feel like we just time skipped. Yeah. How many years has it been? It was 3 years before we just flashed ahead. Somewhat, I suppose. That was only 50. Okay. Cool, 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 cool. Cool, cool, cool. Spent 50 years learning that? It looks like in her old age, at some point, Flame stopped wearing her earrings. But she still has the necklace. Oh, is this the start of her learning random spells that are not just meant for killing? Yeah, it looks like she's not wearing her earrings anymore. And while the pendant and oh wait, no, she is. You just couldn't see it under her hair. Oh, okay. The pendant and earrings are very similar, but it looked like the earrings had like an extra little gold bit and were potentially longer and more more rectangular than the more kind of tear-shaped, almost oblong pendant, which is the shape that Frieren then ends up wearing as earrings herself. I don't know what that means, but it is something that I noticed. And it was something that was easy to comment on as opposed to a lot of the other things in this episode. I I definitely recognize what is that creature? Okay. I definitely recognize that I haven't been talking much this episode. And it's just because there's been a lot of different things revealed. And even though some of them are like super small reveals, they are very there have been a lot of things this episode that have been relevant to things that I have talked about previously. So it's been hard to fully kind of address different things as they've happened. Lamau. Oh? Let me guess. Just a feeling. Yep. Which is what she. Okay, cool, 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 cool. Oh. So many. Screw it. I've made it this far without talking very much. We're just not going to talk very much until the end of the episode, most likely. I'll comment on some things later. Oh, som Frieren. Short-sighted much? Ah, yes. Can't have had more than 100 years of training. When's the shoe gonna drop? Does she have to like unleash her mana for this thing to gauge her properly? What's going on here? Like we know where this is headed, right? I feel like even before all of the flashbacks throughout this episode, we knew where this was headed. Oh, there it goes. I don't believe that's true, but oh. Okay, so they do know how to recognize suppression. Or at least some of them do. She's starting to get nervous. Why would you do that? She says as she's about to lose this battle because she did that. There it is. Just a little bit more mana than you expected. And rip. Badass. Brutal. Like when the camera does things like that, like follows the vision of someone who just gets absolutely wrecked. Okay, God, that. Okay, so. I don't like doing this. In fact, I don't think I've ever done this for a reaction video. I definitely haven't done it here on the Watchalong channel, but I don't think I've done it for my original reaction channel either. But I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to say a couple of things here in a minute, but I think what I'm honestly going to do is I have something to do shortly, unfortunately, but I'll come back. I'm going to come back later, and I'm going to kind of go through the episode and talk about various things like sequentially as they happen throughout the episode rather than doing what I normally do, which is like sit here and recall things and give ideas on them and such. Because again, I feel like there were a lot of different things that were said and happened in this episode that even if they are not necessarily like hugely consequential or like deserving of like 5 to 10 minutes of discussion in like on their like in their own right, like by themselves, it is still the case that like I do feel like there were a lot of things that happened that are relevant to things that I have talked about and been wondering about and such up to this point in the show. So I do want to kind of go through and hit on a lot of those things very specifically rather than just trying to like scrounge up memories of a handful or like skip around here and now like trying to find some of them. I think I'm actually going to like for this episode go back through and just like basically rewatch the episode, but then pause it, talk about things that I feel like talking about, and then cut and edit things together in order to have a more direct and immediate sort of commentary and post episode thoughts and discussion for this episode, as opposed to again the way that I normally do it. So that's that. But before I do that, though, I do just want to say that like, what do I want to say? So yeah, so one, I'm doing that just because like again, like I want to have a more thorough and comprehensive kind of discussion of the various things that happened in this episode that again in some people's eyes might not be super important, but there were a lot of details that like I thought were relevant to again just the way that I've been seeing the show and viewing the show thus far. But also one of the reasons also that I kind of want to do that is because where so many things were happening and they were happening in relatively, there we go, I can snap better with this hand I guess right now, and where they were happening in relatively quick succession, there were a lot of times where like I couldn't really say too much about the things without risking like missing something. And as much as some people in the comments have like commented that they feel like I miss things, like generally speaking, I think I'm pretty good at, like I did this episode, shutting up if I feel like I am actually going to miss something. Do I still miss things on occasion? Sure. But for the most part, I think I'm pretty good at shutting up when I feel like I'm going to miss something. But because I had to do that for this episode in order to, take in all of the different things that were happening, um, a lot of the time I couldn't really say much more than maybe like, oh, that's interesting. And frankly speaking, I find it super frustrating when I'm watching a reactor and the only commentary they can give about something is, oh, that's interesting. I find it really annoying because there are a lot of reactors who say that something's interesting, but they don't really elaborate on what they mean by it being interesting. They don't really try to expand on why they think it's interesting. And I just think that that is frankly, such a lazy way to try to comment on, the actual material in the media. So I don't really like that I did that several times this episode. And so part of the reason that I want to do things the way that I want to do them for this episode is specifically to more heavily and again more thoroughly kind of expand on why I was saying certain things were interesting, because I don't want to leave it at, oh, this is interesting and that's like the full extent of my thoughts on XYZ that happened in the episode. And then the only other thing I want to say for right now before I end this recording, but again I will be back, this video is going to be much longer than if you're watching this video and you're like, hold on, there's another 10, 20, 30 minutes, like it's because again I'm going to come back and I'm going to, when I redo what I talked about doing earlier, like that's still going to be part of this video. I'm not making two separate videos for this episode. The only other thing that I do kind of want to say right now, I think, is just that I think Flame is a really cool character. With what we saw of her this episode, she's just a very cool character because she has like the way, like, so the first thing that we saw with her this episode, what that I commented on before we got into the OP, was about how like her mentality towards how she should be as a mage and like the ways that she should conduct herself and whatnot. and all that, and like how she viewed being dishonorable in terms of how standard mages might consider certain practices is not something that she really cares about if it makes her better at doing what she wants to do, which is exterminate, eradicate, kill demons. I just think that that is, again, just a rather different perspective than you typically find from like heroic or noble sort of characters. And a lot of the ways that we saw her kind of evaluating and I guess evaluating and characterizing and kind of dissecting demon behaviors was just it was very it was very neat because it was just like it's it's very methodical and I don't know, it's just it's more I guess what do I want to say? It's more involved and more it's more thought through. I guess that's the easiest way to say it. It's more thought through from a kind of strategic perspective than I feel like you often get from characters. And so yeah, that was just cool. That was just cool to see her providing some uh she was just yeah, she's just a bit of a she's very much not a standard kind of character. She very much wasn't like in any way like a stereotypical or expected like kind of character. She was very she had a bit of uniqueness to her, which was cool to see. She was interesting. Okay, with that, I'm not gonna do an outro, just because again we're gonna come back. There's gonna be a second part to this that I'm gonna edit in later. But even though I'm not ending things out, I will just remind you if you've made it to this point in the video before we continue on with the next part, like the video, leave a comment, subscribe, blah blah blah, and yeah, I will see y'all in a bit. Okay, I am back. But before we get into actually going through the episode and reviewing and responding to things and such, um, something that I realized after ending last recording and before starting this one is that some people might be wondering if there were things that were happening during the episode that I wanted to kind of respond to and talk about at that time, and there was like a bunch of them. Why don't I just pause the episode and talk about things as they're happening that way instead of saving everything for the end, and in cases like right now, even having to go back and re-record or do a second recording rather in order to specifically go through and try to address a bunch of different things that happen. And there are kind of two, I guess, main reasons why I'm not really interested in doing that. One is simply for ease of editing for me and viewing for you. I feel like, so putting a timer on the screen in order for people to sync up with what I am watching, whether it's for a YouTube channel, whether it's for a Patreon, doesn't matter. That is something that's pretty simple to do, generally speaking. I would assume across like most forms of editing software. However, when it comes to like stopping and starting what that timer is synced to and having like breaks and pauses and stuff, then it becomes a bit more of a pain to edit and try to keep it, in line with what is actually happening. And it also makes it a bit more of a burden for the viewer to then have to like make sure that they are synced up, over and over again rather than just having to do it like once towards the beginning of the video that they're watching, right? So that's kind of one of the reasons there is just for simplicity's sake for both myself and the audience. And then the second reason though is in starting and maintaining reaction content myself, uh I have been, I've been watching like a bunch of other reaction content, sometimes even when it's, something that I recognize pretty quickly that I'm not super personally interested in. Sometimes I just watch it just for the sake of like seeing what other React creators on the platform are doing. And so I've seen a bunch of different kinds of reactions from a bunch of different reactors, and some of whom do, in some way, shape, or form, stop the video while they're watching and start it back up again after they've said something that they wanted to say. And I've just found personally that I, more often than not, am not a huge fan of when reactors do that. I feel like, with some exceptions, of course, I feel like oftentimes it is just the case that when reactors do stop and start things and such, it just kind of it just kind of breaks up the flow of the video in a way that leads to an overall worse video from them. And it is also the case, and this is, I think, more so on the reactors themselves. I don't think it's necessarily an inherent uh, I don't think it's necessarily an inherent detriment of choosing to stop and start and do videos in that way. I think it's more so the reactors just kind of jumping the gun a bit. But I've also seen a number of reactors, specifically those who stop and start videos, who they will stop the video in the middle of a point being made in the show, and they start, like speculating wildly about things that may or may not happen, or like what this means, and so on and so forth. And then they do this for, maybe only a couple minutes, maybe like 5-10 minutes. And then once they start the video again, within like 5 to 10 seconds, once the plot point or like the character moment has completed, it invalidates everything the reactor just said. And while I think that there is something to be said for like speculating just for the sake of speculating, it can be just like it can just be like a fun way to engage with media. I did something similar actually for in one of the recent Dungeon Meshi videos, and like it can just be kind of cool to play with those different possibilities, right? However, a lot of reactors who do this are doing it specifically because they want to be right. They want to be able to say that they thought something was going to happen and then see it happen so that they can go, I was right. I got, I predicted that correctly. And that just feels pretty lame to me, to be honest. And again, they just kind of they're so quick to get these thoughts out because they have these thoughts and they're just like, oh, I need to say this thing that's so incredibly clever. And they want to be right about calling something, that it just kind of they end up just like, in my opinion, kind of making an ass of themselves a lot of times. So I don't want to in any way kind of put myself in a position where I might end up starting to make a habit of doing something similar to that, when it's something that, again, if it's something that I don't like watching, it's also something that I don't personally want to do, right? A lot of content creators are hypocritical. I try not to be. So anyways, with those things being said, that's why I'm doing this the way that I'm doing it here and now. And because I'm not necessarily sure like how this is going to go, how it's going to end up, coming out at the end of it all, once I've edited it and it becomes the final video that is going to be, because I don't necessarily know how it's going to turn out and what it's going to look like on the whole. I guess if you are someone who's watching like this entire video, let me know what you think of what I'm about to do. And if you think that it improved the discussion section, if you think that it seemed like a waste of time, like give me your thoughts. Don't be an asshole, preferably, but give me your thoughts on how you think this compares to my typical post-episode sections of videos. So yeah, now let's go ahead and get into said episode. So right off the bat, we have Flame asking Frieren if she remembers Basalt's last words, and Frieren says that she doesn't. And I think that this is in a way just sort of meant to highlight the way that Frieren and also now that we see Flame also views demons as creatures who use words only as a means to an end. Creatures who like their words aren't important to remember because their words aren't meaningful. Their words don't actually there's no like legitimate intent really behind their words, because again, the way that they see them, the way that these two mages at the very least, if not, there's others, but the way that these mages in particular see creatures that they call demons is as creatures who only use words, again, as a means of manipulation and deceit. And to that end, I think it's also kind of interesting that Frieren kind of describes this behavior. She says their kind uses words only to deceive humans. She says this seemingly before Flame puts this. It is seemingly an idea that comes from Frieren. It is seemingly something that she says before Flame has like influenced her opinion on what these creatures are called. It maybe there was, maybe they had some kind of discussion and conversation about this prior to what we're seeing here on screen. Maybe this is something that they've like talked about before, and Flame is basically, in a sense, like quizzing Frieren to make sure that she is make sure that she's like on the same page and like going down a path and like in the direction of understanding that Flame wants her to be in, but that's not really the way that I'm perceiving the way that this initial scene is playing out. I am seeing this as Flame is trying to get Frieren's opinion, and then she is going to respond, depending on what Frieren says. And Frieren is the one who initially who offers the original opinion of their kind uses words only to deceive humans. So I think that there is something interesting to be said there, just in the sense that, again, this is an idea. This isn't something that like Frieren just absorbed from someone older and more capable than her. This is something that this is a conclusion that she came to of her own volition before Flame necessarily influenced her in that way. And then we get this idea that this is one of the few things that I was able to kind of comment on in the initial reaction, which was this idea that Flame believes that playing unfair against an enemy that is also playing unfair is like, it's not something to necessarily shy away from. If it furthers your goal of, and this is using their words, exterminating demons, then it's fine. It's even if it is dishonorable to do so, which that says something interesting about, the way that magic users kind of view themselves as kind of a monolith as a group. But I think I want to touch on that a little bit later. So, but the way that I touched on, again, I touched on this in the initial reaction, where I said that this is different than your typical heroic or noble type character. I think it is also, just to kind of take that idea a step further, I think it's also a very different thing when it is coming from a mentor. The scene also has Flame telling Frieren to refer to her as master, right? And I think that when it comes to talking about expected behaviors and worldviews from heroic characters, from noble characters, also looking at like mentor characters, characters who play mentorship roles to some of our main characters, in this case Frieren. It is also the case that you oftentimes don't really see characters like this who are willing to play unfair. The way that the way that this kind of translates from theory into practice is that Flame is big on this idea of suppressing your mana so that you are able to deceive demons with your magical presentation in the way that they deceive people with their words, right? And this is very different from the way that, again, typically mentors, the way that you see them help in rearing, young warriors or whatever, in this case, a young mage, the way that you see them doing so is by, teaching them proper training, teaching them like techniques, teaching them how to fight, like it's very direct, practical manners of teaching. But what Flame is teaching Frieren is underhanded tactics, which is not it's not typically what you see of like main characters and characters who play these types of roles. It's much more, again, it's just much like you don't typically see characters like being sneaky and deceitful unless they're the bad guys, right? Because that kind of behavior is just stereotypically not how things are how you often see fiction framed. As a really quick note, I think that I commented previously how it was odd to me that Lugner was able to escape from Frieren in the very brief flashback that we saw to their previous encounter. But the fact that he is, even though he recognizes that like he's dying here, I think it is kind of interesting to see the extent of the wound he suffered without like immediately dissipating. And that does make it a little easier for me to think about manners in which he may have been able to escape the previous circumstance that we saw him in. Before, you might remember, I was kind of like, how did he live there exactly? But seeing that he is just like he personally seems to be a very resilient demon when it comes to taking damage. That does help to make the fact that he in some manner managed to escape. It just makes a little bit more sense. And also, speaking of the way that he is like, very clearly currently dying, it is interesting to see that he is, unlike we saw from Drop, for instance, it is interesting to see how he seems very much to have accepted his fate. He's not trying to plea for his life, he's not trying to bargain or anything like that. And what's more, if anything, what we see is he is talking about things that are not going to affect him at the moment, or that there are things that aren't going to be relevant. There are things that he's talking about things that are in no way going to result in him being able to get out of this situation and in some way survive. He's talking about Frieren. He's not talking about himself. He's not talking about Fern, who he's facing. He is talking about Frieren, who is facing off against Lady Aura. Presumably, he doesn't know that for a fact, but that's what he is presuming. And something that I think is very interesting about that is, while it could be seen as him just trying to, like, in a sense, instigate and and kind of like get under Fern's skin and suggest to her that, like, your master's in danger, it is still, I don't think that, even if it is true that that's kind of like part of why he's doing it, or even most of why he's doing it, I think that it suggests something about demon relationships that, again, just kind of, it reveals that there is, even if it's not much, it reveals that there is a bit more depth than we are sometimes suggested that demons have in terms of their communication. Like, even later on in this episode, we're going to see Flame talking about how demons form like the barest level of connection necessary in order to fight against humans, right? And what we've seen is, even if, again, I don't think that that's like entirely false, but I also think that, at least for some demons, there is a bit more connection than what you would consider the barest level. Like, we saw Lugner and Lenny, in theory, last episode. The way that I was reading the situation, they seemed to be like showing some level of concern over the other's condition while they were having their separate fights. And I think that what we are seeing, I think that what we have seen from this trio as a whole, acting as executioners of Aura, is that, they care a lot about her mission, her goal, her aims. They care about supporting her. And a species or race that is entirely like self-interested, they would have a stronger sense of self-preservation than, at least I think they would have a stronger sense of self-preservation, to the point where it would override some of these things that they're doing, where they're kind of acting in a way that is more about, like, again, kind of the bigger goals of something beyond them by someone who is above them in their hierarchy. We're still on this scene with Lugner getting ready to be wiped out by Fern. But again, I'm just going to, because I've already seen the entire episode, I'm just going to play on knowledge from slightly ahead in order to talk about something now, which is that as the episode progresses and we see, particularly in flashbacks, Flame and Frieren talking about how, demons can't suppress their mana, how they have no reason to, how they wouldn't see the point in doing so. With that in mind, I think it is then interesting to see that Lugner, in his final moments here, is able to kind of logically piece together what Fern and Frieren do. He's able to understand that the way that he was defeated, and that something, and that, like, the way that Fern and Frieren act as mages, he's able to understand, like, he's able to intuitively figure out this notion that they are doing what they're doing, right? And I think that again, just kind of, well, I don't think, again, it's not that I think that the perception of our main characters about demons is wrong, but I think that it is just slightly narrower than it should be, because I don't know from the ways that not necessarily Frieren, but definitely the way that Flame talks about demons in this episode, and again for Frieren it's slightly before this episode as well. I don't know that they would have believed demons to have been able to kind of figure this out, because they, in a funny sense, the way that they are suppressing their mana in order to make demons underestimate them, they have kind of also underestimated demons' ability to figure that trick out if given the appropriate context in order to do so. It might not be something that demons just naturally think to consider on their own, but we do see in this episode, not just with Lugnir now, but we also see a bit more between Frieren and Aura later, that like they can figure this concept out, they can understand it. And I'll talk a little bit more about those latter two and this topic once we get to that point. But yeah, that's something that, again, I feel like demons are not quite as simple as we're sometimes as they are sometimes talked about. And then also, again, getting back to this idea of like fairness and what it means to be, I get in this sense, an honorable mage, because, you know, again, Flame refers to it as being a dishonorable tactic, and here Lugnir is saying that you're a disgrace to all mages. And something about this sort of like expected like haughtiness and presentory manner of magic users is interesting, because the way that Lugnir's speaking to me doesn't really it and this is coming from someone, I think it's worth noting, this is coming from someone who kind of agreed with Frieren with the on the idea that demons are basically a kind of animal, right? And yet he's saying that what you're doing isn't fair and you're a disgrace to all mages. Like, so to me, that the fact that both he and Flame feel similarly about this tactic, it's a difficult idea to fully articulate, but I think it says something about the way that society as a whole, and not even just civilized society, because, you know, if you're going to separate like demon kind from humanity, dwarves, elves, etc., like there is a connection here. There's no gap in or like divide between the way that these different creatures are seeing what they are doing. So I think that it says something about mages and magic users in general that I do kind of hope is explored further in future episodes, because yeah, I feel like there's potentially a lot of wider implications about what this means about status and status among magic users, which status is something that Flame will talk about later. So let's keep going. Okay, and I think I noted this during the reaction, but I did recognize that this is a scene that we've seen before. I recognize the broken swing set. I recognize the burning homes or buildings, whatever they are, in the background. So like I knew that this was something we had seen a brief flash of before. And again, this is kind of why I wanted to do what I'm currently doing with this episode, because it ties back together a lot of things that we have seen or heard brief flashes of in previous episodes. I will say, I didn't necessarily immediately make the connection that Basalt the Throne was a general of the Demon King's army, and that is different than being one of these seven sages. I'm not necessarily sure what the kind of hierarchical differences are between a general of the Demon King's army and one of the seven sages. I imagine that because the seven sages are like a named group, a named subset, they're probably more powerful, but I don't know necessarily to what extent. Then that would be something that I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about later. I think it's also worth noting that after Flame essentially berated this dying child, she seemed basically ready to walk away and leave her for dead, until Frieren spoke up and said something about, like, you know, you seem to be a more powerful mage than I am. And that was what caught Flame's attention and brought her back to talk to her and like ask her name and end up bringing her with her. So that's a little interesting. Arguably says something about Flame's character. I also noticed that Frieren has the same staff in this scene as she does in the present, and I would not have expected that. I wonder if, I wonder if magical implements are something that are like in some way innate to magic users from a very young age, or if they bind with it and keep it for their lives, or I don't know. That was something visually that I just kind of noticed, that is a little detail that probably doesn't necessarily have like super big significance in any particular direction, but was still just like, oh hey, interesting. Interesting to note. And the way that their initial worldviews clash is also quite interesting. The way that, Frieren sees her inability to protect her village as a personal failure. She thinks that because she was strong, she had a duty to protect them and that she failed in doing so. Whereas Flame was like, if I was in your shoes, I would have ran. So this is not somebody who, how to say this? This is somebody who is very much not focused on what is immediately in front of her, if that makes sense. Like, it's not that she is necessarily not good or not caring, but she believes that regardless of if she could defeat the enemy, if she felt like there was a risk, a threat, a danger, she felt that she would feel, based on what she's saying here, Flame, she would feel that it is more appropriate for her to act in such a way that preserves her own life rather than trying to protect others, which again, that's not necessarily bad. It's not like inherently bad or not good, but it does show a different way of looking at things, rather than, I think that a lot of, again, talking about differences from like classical or stereotypical like heroic type characters, a lot of characters, especially, and you see this like, and sometimes very explicitly in shonen series, in anime, you see a lot of characters who like their goal is to protect as many people in front of them as they can. And the sort of mindset that we're currently and Frieren, again, to an extent, kind of falls in line with this, where she's like, I couldn't protect them, and she feels bad about that. And Flame's just kind of like, that's the wrong way of thinking about it, kid. So again, just very, very different from what you might normally expect. I think it's also slightly less common to see the mentor apprentice relationship start in the way that it does here, where Flame decides that because Frieren has potential, she's going to be her apprentice. And typically what you see, and while this isn't like a super rarity, what we're seeing here, this manner of doing things, I think that normally the order of operations you see is like precocious youngster with potential seeks out an experienced and well-known master, and they have to kind of prove themselves to that master before they are allowed to become an apprentice. And if anyone's made it to this point and is wondering like why I'm pointing out some of the things I'm pointing out, I think it is because it informs the kind of the like, these little factors inform the dynamic and kind of relationship that the characters have, and that is relevant to considering how characters got to where they are. Because again, this is obviously, these flashbacks are way in the past, but if we are going to think about Frieren in the present, we need to have a better understanding of where she came from in some respects. And so knowing these things about her relationship with Flame do help us to try to understand what kind of person she is a bit better. Also, something that I think makes this kind of conversation about the unfairness of suppressing mana as a tactic a bit trickier to have is that there seems to be a kind of distinct but also kind of vague distinction between suppressing one's mana and concealing one's presence, because what we're seeing right now is these three demons who are supposedly stronger than the general that Frieren killed. who are approaching, and they were concealing their presence until such time as they decided to make themselves known. And we also saw previously in the last episode that, well, in 2 episodes ago, we saw that Fern was able to conceal her presence from Linny and Lugner, despite the fact that Linny was supposedly some kind of like expert at detection. And then last episode, we saw that Linny and Lugner themselves were also able to conceal their presence. So there is a distinct difference between that, but also it seems to me like it is fairly similar in concept. So that does kind of I feel like that does complicate that topic a little bit. And this is kind of probably one of the first like big things that I seized on in this episode. One of the bigger details that I first made note of, which is kill all of the elves. Those are the Demon King's orders. And so the village that Frieren was in was likely targeted very specifically because it was an elf village. It wasn't just some like random act of conquest by the Demon King's army. They are specifically seeking out to kill all the elves. And this makes me wonder and assume that there is probably, some reason for that, right? And so first of all, it makes me think that elves are probably likely have a stronger affinity for magic naturally than other races do, than the other races like humans or dwarves or whoever else. And what's more, demons recognize because of the manner that we know we've had Lugner talk about how demons spend their entire lives practicing one form of magic and getting better at it day by day. So because elves are long-lived races, not only do they probably have some sort of natural affinity towards magic, but they have longer to practice their magic and grow to a point of excelling at magic and eventually becoming a threat. So the Demon King saw elves as a race to be a threat to his army's power, most likely, and that's why we see this order that these three demons here are acting on, and again, probably also the Daemon General Basalt was acting on. And what we also see here is an additional explanation for why elves are slowly going extinct. I didn't think that it was really a particularly good explanation by Frieren to say that elves were slowly going extinct because they didn't have a super strong sex drive or interest in making romantic connections or attachments with others. So this also kind of helps fill in that blank that I had previously, which is that elves are such a rarity, not just because they're not super interested in reproduction and forming, connections and communities and such, because of just the way that they feel as individuals on an individual level, but they're also probably a rarity because a lot of them have probably been straight up killed out. And also, at some point, surely, elves probably realized that they were being hunted down by the Demon King's army. And as such, they likely made themselves scarce intentionally to avoid drawing attention to themselves. Like I just mentioned connections, but also I mentioned community. Like villages, like Frieren's, would become natural targets. So a lot of elves probably tried to make themselves scarce, tried to make themselves lesser known, and tried to avoid having active community with one another because the more they congregated, the more likely they probably were to then become targets of the Demon King. Oh, actually, because I had already incorporated this piece of knowledge into my understanding of this universe's world building and lore, I actually forgot to mention it earlier when it would have been the first time that I recognized it during the reaction. But the fact that Frieren's childhood home over 1,000 years ago was attacked by a general of the Demon King's army, that tells us that the Demon King has been around for 1,100 plus years, and that and the Demon King's forces were like to be feared and recognized already, like across at least a fairly large expanse of the world, I would say, since Frieren seemingly knew who it was, Flame knew who it was, who sent that person, who that specific general was, and that they were part of the Demon King's army. So I'd previously, during various bits of conversation talking about the world and why certain things were or were not the way that they were. Something that came up before was, how long has the Demon King been around? How long has their presence been, kind of oppressive to the rest of the world? And this kind of answers that. Quite a while. I also am pretty sure I made note of this line during the reaction. Flame says, "It's true that I am painfully aware of what it's like to be a powerful mage." And I think that that phrasing is odd. I There is not seemingly in this situation appropriate context in my mind to warrant the phrase "I'm painfully aware of what it's like." This suggests that there is some notable downside to being a powerful mage that she has experienced firsthand, that she has directly experienced, that makes her, in some sense, maybe not necessarily regret being a powerful mage, but kind of lament the fact that she is to some extent. And I do wonder if, again, with the limited information that we kind of have to go off at this point in time, I wonder if she has maybe experienced something similar to Frieren, where when she was younger, because of her power, she thought that she was capable of maybe protecting people, and then in reality, she ended up not being able to do so. And that makes her painfully aware in this moment because she is recognizing similarities from her past with Frieren's present in this moment. So that, and if it's not that, then I do wonder what exactly was intended by that phrasing. And the way that she then follows this up by talking about the confidence, the pride, the arrogance that the demons have in their magics, in their capabilities as magic practitioners, does, I think, kind of lead itself to a similar situation as to what I just described, where being, as Flame describes it, stupidly overconfident, she seems to, again, kind of resent this presentation by them, seemingly because she recognizes it as something that she's probably done herself in her past that has resulted in something bad happening that she likely blames herself for. And again, just kind of looking at the different ways that Flame talks about her strategy and way of life of hiding her level of magic, it's a cowardly and unfair way to fight that makes a mockery of magic. So presumably just sort of being a magic practitioner, again, regardless of demon, human, elven, whatever, there seems to be some sort of inherent pride in being a magic user and being a magic practitioner. And again, leading credence to the idea that I posited before about the fact that, Flame experienced some big tragedy or something similar earlier in her life that has led her to a lot of her current beliefs. We have Frieren saying, again, in a way that makes a lot of sense, given that Frieren is a child who, just survived her entire village being destroyed. She says, "Demons took everything from me," and Flame just agrees and says, "Me too." So it seems to be the case that something happened that, led Flame to this point, which might that if you take that kind of, if you take that quote of what I just said out of context, you might think, well, duh. But again, these things, it's worth recognizing how these things do very directly build on each other. But then we get into some slightly more interesting agreements, in my opinion, where Frieren says that she wants to be able to exterminate all of them, and Flame says "me too" to that. And I think that the thing that is interesting about that is we know that Flame is incredibly powerful, right? We saw her just kill these 3 demons who were supposedly, stronger than this general, which I don't know how that compares to 7 Sages. I don't know how that compares to the Demon King himself. But we know that Flame is very powerful, not just in flashback, but again, also in present. Flame is considered like the legendary mage. Why didn't she try to stand against the Demon King? Or did she try to stand against the Demon King and failed? Is that what happened that led her to her current position and worldviews? Like, you'd think that somebody who has seemingly lost everything to demons and who wants to see them all destroyed wouldn't be living the kind of life that Flame is. And, until she happened upon Frieren, she didn't even have like an apprentice or anything. She just seemed to be kind of living her life as far as we know. And like again, we don't see her or haven't heard about her like trying to face the Demon King, trying to like actively hunt down demons in any way. So I think it makes you wonder, if she does have these beliefs, why isn't she acting on them necessarily? So I think it's quite possible that perhaps she went on a journey to put an end to the Demon King, similar to how the Heroes Party did, Frieren and Himmel and them, and maybe she failed. And then, unlike Frieren, though, we see that Flame held on to her love of magic into adulthood, whereas Frieren, after studying with Flame and being her apprentice for a couple decades, that love turned into kind of just like, it's all right. She feels so about it. And the fact that when asked to suppress the amount of mana she was outputting, Frieren said any elf can do this. Also, again, just kind of lends credence to the idea that the Demon King felt threatened by elves because they are probably a naturally magically inclined species / race. It always feels weird whether trying to figure out whether I should use the word race or species in fantasy settings because of just like what those words actually mean. And again, Flame talks about how, you should be fooling demons for life. You should spend your entire life suppressing your mana flow to fool demons, deceive them into thinking that you're weaker than you are. And she's saying that you should be doing this like I am, right? But we don't see her. Again, maybe it's entirely possible. I think it's actually probably likely that we're going to learn more about Flame later and what she either did as Frieren's master or possibly outside of being Frieren's master, maybe as someone who does hunt down and slay demons. But again, why are you spending your life suppressing your mana in order to be better equipped at fighting demons if you're not actually actively going out and fighting demons? Is it just for those random nighttime strolls to the woods where you happen upon powerful demons? Like it seems like there are just some things that don't seem to be adding up. So while there are a lot of things that are being answered this episode, it is also very much opening more questions. Then again, another interesting little detail here: living for over 500 years is considered fairly long-lived for a demon, and that's probably why she's become one of the 7 sages of destruction. Because the longer they live, the longer they can spend training, the more mana and more powerful magics they can wield. So that just kind of makes sense. But also, again, so we see Aura, having lived for over 500 years, is fairly long lived for a demon. We see a demon like Lugner, who was alive for you can say at least 100 years, because he was an adult when he faced off against Frieren 80 some years ago, and he was still alive now. And we have seen that demons do age from a child progression to like until they get to like an adult point. But then also, what we kind of learned this episode is that the Demon King existed for at least 1100 years. So that says something about not only the power that we can likely assume the Demon King had, but it also says something about the kind of range of lifespans of demons. If over 500 years is considered fairly long-lived, and that's one of the 7 sages, but then we have the Demon King who lived for over 1,000. But like, so other demons don't live for as long. Is it that they don't live for as long because they get killed? Or is it because they don't live as long because they die of, natural causes, old age, as like, humans do? Like what is so we're learning a bit more, but there's still, depending on how deep you want to go with it, there's also, again, more questions. I'm honestly still not entirely sure what to make of Flame's whole explanation and exploration of this idea that like mana for demons and she calls it an inability, but I think it's more so an unwillingness to suppress their mana is akin to like wealth and status for humans, and that, suppressing your mana more than is necessary would be like a noble throwing away their title and status and, becoming a beggar. I'm still not entirely sure what to make of that. I feel like if anything, it it could be explained by demons having a fairly dominant position in the world as a race, and so they don't necessarily see the need in such a utility. But again, the demons, like, they're described even by Flame and Frieren as being cunning creatures. And we see to some small extent like their ability to, grasp higher concepts and plan and strategize around, certain activities, such as, the kind of the infiltration mission by the trio of demons as a you know pretend peace envoy. And so this idea that like this idea that they are too proud to like consider this alternative of like suppressing their mana, it just seems a little off to me. And then speaking of off, I very much still don't know what to make of this. Frieren, you're lucky you're not a demon. That just seems like such a weird line to me. Like, if I don't know that, like, I feel like with the way that we view demons in this world, I feel like there should be more reasons to, in a sense, celebrate that one isn't a demon, beyond just like, oh, you wouldn't be able to have this mentality of suppressing your magic if you were a demon. Like, that's like, is that really why we should be focusing on being glad that someone isn't a demon? Like, it just, and the fact that she says something like, the fact that what she says is you're lucky you're not a demon, and not something like you're lucky you can do this thing, this, you can do that, like you can suppress your mana, like that. Again, I don't know, I feel like there's something there's something that I am not quite connecting, I feel, with this line, that I think this line could potentially be significant later. I don't know. Okay, and now we fast forwarded 50 years, and we have Flame as an old woman and Frieren like having received all of the training of the past 50 years, right? 50, 53, something like, yeah, like that years. And again, we haven't necessarily, maybe at some point during this period, Flame was like, Batmaning it up and out there killing demons. But as far as we know, they've just kind of been training this whole time. And I wonder if kind of, to try to continue some of the points I was talking about earlier, I do wonder if maybe the reason why Flame wasn't known as, even though she's known as the legendary mage, the reason why she's not known as like the legendary mage who defeated the Demon King or who challenged the Demon King, whether or not she considered herself able to do so, maybe she was looking more big picture, more long term, and maybe she saw Frieren as being able to more successfully do what she wanted to do, but didn't maybe consider herself able to do, which was, again, eradicate demonkind, Demon King and all. Because she knows that Frieren is an elf, who will be a long-lived race as long as she doesn't do anything stupid. She knows that if she imparts her knowledge and training to Frieren, that over time Frieren will be a greater mage than she could ever be. And so maybe that's part of what we are supposed to be, or not necessarily supposed to be gleaning from this, but maybe that's part of how you can read into this is kind of like the reason for why Flame is doing what she's doing. I also think it's interesting that despite the fact that Frieren at this point is still pretty young, because like when we started these flashbacks, she was a child, and now it's been 50 years. Like she's still younger than Flame at this point, who again is an old woman at this stage, but she still, even though 50 years has been like most of her life, she still refers to it as being only 50 years. So that's just, I think, something that's interesting, is that like it didn't take her becoming hundreds and hundreds of years old to start thinking of like, oh, what's a couple decades here and there. This is something that's like always been part of how she views time, as kind of like a concept. And I do recognize, of course, that like, here she is addressing the fact that she's glad she taught Frieren her magic, and if you keep training, eventually you might even take down the Demon King. I recognize that like she does explicitly comment on Frieren's potential for a legacy, and then she also says, that Frieren shouldn't try to have a legacy or be well known until such time as she takes down the Demon King. But again, there's the idea of like, why there's this question of why did Flame want Frieren to inherit this kind of this this task rather than taking it on herself? Is it just because she considers herself not able to do so? Like there's a story there, right? And this Field of Flowers spell, which is, ostensibly one of the first magic she learned that wasn't how to fight, is a spell that we know that she is still familiar with to this day, because she adjusted the spell in order to make a Field of Flowers for Himmel. And then speaking of Himmel, we now see that the reason Frieren decided to stop being such a hermit was only once Himmel and the two other members of the party approached her and asked her to join. And we see that kind of, Himmel is a kindred spirit with Frieren, in the sense that they were both able to recognize how great another mage was, despite the fact that, mana suppression was being employed. And I think there's something to be said about Frieren's relationship with Flame, and then 1,000 years later, her relationship with Himmel, as being one of like feeling like naturally kindred spirits, in a sense, as like geniuses who are naturally gifted and talented. And I mean, even though we don't see much of Himmel like doing things, we just see him talking in flashbacks for the most part. It is still the case that he's considered the hero who defeated the Demon King, right? He is the hero of the heroes party. And so I think it's safe to assume that he is, in some sense and capacity, naturally gifted. And so that is there's a bit of an interesting kind of connection there, I think, between those three characters across vast periods of time through Frieren. And then we see some flashes of the adventuring party, the heroes party, doing things that we've actually seen our new party doing in this series, which is facing off against a red dragon, facing off against Qual, facing off against Aura, and then finally making their way to the Demon King's castle. And then I think also touching on Frieren's isolation a bit more, and how she seems to have, lived a secluded life, been, again, basically a hermit from the time that Flame died to the time that Himmel's party found her and recruited her. I think that combined with the other things that we saw in the flashbacks this episode do kind of put her character in a more understanding light. Like, she was a child when everyone in her village was killed. And then she was taken on as an apprentice and lived for 50 some odd years as, being taught magic by Flame. And while we saw them going into whatever city in that country they lived in was that looked like ancient Greece or Rome or something, It is. I think it is fair to assume that they probably spent most of their time at Flame's residence training in magic, and then she lived alone for something like 1,000 years before again being recruited by the Heroes Party. And I think that when you look at her life in that way, it becomes pretty clear why she is the way that she is in the sense of like not being good at connecting with people. Say what you want about the extent to which you think that she understands people or the extent to which you think that she can, like read people's emotions or intentions or whatever. Like regardless of the level of her, I guess, emotional awareness or intelligence, the fact of the matter is I think that it is. I think it's fairly safe to say. I think that you can fairly assert that Frieren is not great at communicating, right? I think that I don't think that that is an unfair statement to say that Frieren is kind of bad at communicating with others. And seeing all of these flashbacks to understand kind of the trajectory of her life, it now makes a lot of sense why she is that way. Because I mean, just look at what happened to her, right? Look at how she has lived her life to this point. And then as Aura starts to kind of chronicle sort of the biographic details of Frieren, where she's like, you made your first major appearance 80 years ago, you defeated the Demon King with the Heroes Party, and you're a mysterious elven mage whose age is unknown. I feel like looking at Frieren a little bit less as a person and more of as this like kind of enigmatic figure, and then also going back to like to a small extent like what Lugner said in the beginning of the episode about how like oh, without the hero's party to protect her, she's a threat, but she's not like a major threat. I personally see these things and I start to wonder like what I start to wonder like how powerful is she? Maybe that's a weird direction to go with this, but when I see demons sort of painting Freer in a certain way while also acknowledging that like they don't really know that much about her, something that I have kind of loosely wondered about before and start to wonder about even more now, especially with what we're about to see happen to Aura. I start to wonder to what extent was defeating the Demon King a group effort? To what extent did Freeman just like massively overpower him? I'm actually very curious to know. I'm sure that we're going to get more information about this later because I think that one way or the other, it will probably be relevant. Whether it was like a hard fought battle where everybody like almost died, or whether it was the case that like Frieren kind of sandbagged, and then once they got to the final boss, she just like blew him away, like one shot, no problem. I think that regardless of what we find out specifically, I think that it will tell us something. And yeah, I do wonder. I do wonder just how powerful Frieren is, and to what extent she could actually eradicate demonkind if she so chose. Because again, we're seeing with these flashbacks, we see, this hatred of demons. We saw it in the present a little bit when she encountered Lugner and then Aura with the just kind of the way that she interacted with them. She very much seemed not a fan, not interested in them as creatures. But we've seen in this flashback that she hates demons, that she wants to eradicate demons, and we know that she has we know that she played some role. Again, we don't know to what extent exactly, but we know that she played some role in defeating the Demon King. But then, similar to kind of the way that I was talking about Flame earlier, dear God, I just smacked the mic. Um, Similar to the way that I was talking about Flame earlier, she seems to have kind of taken it easy and just sort of gone and just sort of like lived her life casually after defeating the Demon King. Maybe the 1,000 years leading up to that, she was training, she didn't think she was ready, blah blah blah. And then once the Heroes Party arrived, she was like, okay, now's my chance, now's my opportunity to take out the Demon King. But then after that, why wouldn't she hunt down people like Aura? Even now that she's traveling with Fern and now Stark, like they kind of are just going on like a relatively casual adventure, right? Like this whole thing with Aura happened by chance. Frieren didn't seek this out necessarily, unless she expected Aura and expects other members of, the other remnants of the Demon King's army to be on their path to back to the Demon Castle and I forget what it's called, but the place that they refer to as like heaven. Um, yeah, I wonder why Frieren hasn't been more active in kind of seeking her vengeance, seeking her and Flame's vengeance, if that makes sense. And it might seem a little inappropriate to comment again on the way that humans and elves, or at the very least Flame and Frieren, kind of underestimated demons right now, as we are about to see Aura die because of underestimating Frieren. Um, but I think that the way that, Frieren acknowledges here that she's surprised demons are capable of observing mana that precisely in order to, again, what Aura just mentioned was like gauging instability and variation to recognize suppressing mana. That shows that, like, they're aware of this tactic to some extent. So the way that kind of, again, some of the discussions about this behavior from Flame and Frieren were kind of dismissive of demons' abilities to like expect or counter this in any capacity. I think that it's just I think that it was just like a little too narrow and did kind of underestimate exactly what demons are capable of. Obviously, eventually Frieren ended up, defeating the Demon King and at least a couple of the seven sages. With, we know Qual is dead, we know Aura's about to die. So like it worked out in the end, but I do feel like they did maybe underestimate their opponents ultimately. If you do want to like if you do want to objectively assess the situation and not just look at like the end results and, be like, oh well, it all worked out, so it's okay. Like I do think that they did to some extent underestimate what demons were capable of, but because they took their precautions to the kind of extreme extent that they did, it still ended up working out all okay. And because Frieren and Flame are, as Lugner called them, geniuses. And then, of course, we have Aura in denial of the situation that Frieren is explaining as the situation is sort of unraveling and revealing itself to her. And to an extent, I think it's justified, just because, one of the things we heard about Aura's ability in the last episode was that like the scales do judge fairly in terms of like measuring mana. And I'm pretty sure I commented during the reaction to some degree that I thought it was a little silly the way that like the scales initially measured things the way that Aura expected, and then like as she approached Frieren, the scales started tipping slightly, and then once Frieren released her mana, it was then like, oh nope, that's there's a clear winner here. um, and that you're very much out of your league. And yeah, I think that is, I don't know. I get why they did it for like cool factor reasons, but practically speaking, in universe, I don't really understand why it wasn't just like an immediate win in terms of like measuring out their mana against each other. And then also again, kind of reiterating the point that I previously talked about with like wondering just how powerful Frieren is and like to what extent she was just the one who like kind of blasted through the final hurdle of defeating the Demon King with the hero's party potentially. Um, it does the Aura is considered, from what, as far as we know, Aura is considered like a very powerful member of the Seven Sages, right? Her whole thing is having a massive amount of mana in order to use her scales of obedience, right? And yet Frieren is just clearly outclassing her in terms of mana output, just like far and away, right? That's what we're being shown in this episode, in this scene, is that Frieren is just ridiculously above her and beyond her. And while it has been, 80 some odd years, I don't think that Frieren is necessarily at a power level currently that is, significantly beyond where she was when they defeated the Demon King's army, again, 80 some years ago. I don't think that is particularly likely. And so seeing how much stronger she is just in terms of raw mana output, and this is again after Aura acknowledged that like she expended a bunch of mana dispelling the magic on a number of the immortal soldiers. Like, I think that this demonstration shows that, like, again, in terms of like power scaling and just like again, so where are demon generals? Where are seven sages? Where is the demon king? And where is Frieren? I just think that is I think that the we are slowly being given information to try to, if one is so inclined to do so. I think that we are slowly being given information to like try to piece these things together in a way that is just kind of I imagine it is exploring questions and answers that are going to that I assume are going to be addressed later. I think that at some point we're probably going to get some level of looking at what the actual conflict was like between the Heroes Party and the Demon King. And I think that we are going to probably get more exploration into like why Frieren, with the power that she has, is or is not doing certain things. And then this might be me reading a bit too into things. I think it probably is. But visually, there are times where, because of Frieren's twin tails that she has, there are times where her twin tails kind of flare up, and it looks a little reminiscent of the way that demons have horns. I don't know. Just something visually that I have kind of noticed once or twice. And so, as I kind of mentioned during the initial reaction, like, this was not a twist for me, the way that this all happened and worked out. Like, I was expecting this even before we got this whole episode about like suppressing mana and stuff. I was expecting this to be the case, that like things were going to go the way that they went. So because of that, arguably some of the impact was taken out of the end of this episode for me, but I still thought it was pretty cool. I think last episode was definitely cooler, for me at least, in my opinion. But this episode was still really nice for a lot of reasons, and I did enjoy. I did enjoy the way, again, that a lot of things that just sort of to this point felt sort of incomplete to me did kind of start to be filled in. Again, a lot of the answers that we got from things that were revealed in this episode still kind of raised more questions, or maybe just like changed the kind of framing of the question in some ways. But the fact that we are starting to now actually get some of the answers and coming full circle with some of the things that, again, I feel like have been left a little too open ended and up to interpretation thus far, is something that I have been waiting to see in this show, frankly speaking. And so I was glad to see it. I hope we get more of it. And I think that that is probably about all I want to say for this episode. Actually, one more thing, real quick. I've noticed that the animation at times in this episode was very distinctly bad. And the reason that I didn't comment on it is because I don't really care. Like, I think the most standout probably example was during one of the flashbacks when Flame and Frieren were walking down some stairs. The animation was like super crude and rudimentary, but like, you don't need everything to look super polished, right? It like you don't need every little casual scene to look super, super high end, super smooth, super slick, super like big budget, as long as you're putting the animation in the right places, right? So even though I'm somebody who does typically care a lot about animation, like, there are definitely times where animation is very noticeably bad that I'm just kind of like, okay, and so I do just want to like mention that, like, I recognize that some of the animation in this episode was not very good, but there was also things like in this episode that looked pretty good, especially like in the final scene of the episode. And we also just came off of episode 9, where we had that really good combat, really well animated combat between Stark and Linny and Fern and Lugner. So it was not something that I minded at all seeing in this episode, with some of the less some scenes having some less attention to detail with their animation. Anyways, that's gonna be it. Again, let me know if you liked or didn't like the way that I ended up doing this post episode segment, because yeah, it took a long time, this recording. I know that this whole recording isn't going to be part of the video, but this recording is an hour and 44 minutes at the moment. So it took a long time to do this. I, frankly speaking, am not necessarily sure if I liked it. So unless the reception is like super positive, I'm probably not going to do this again. Also talking for, even though I wasn't talking obviously for the entire duration of this recording, because I did so much talking back to back to back, it did kind of wear on my throat a little bit, I can already tell. And I also, frankly speaking, don't like having my little key light on me for over an hour at a time. It's just, yeah, I don't know. It bothers me. I don't like having a light shining directly in my face, even when it is a bit of a softer light like this. So yeah, I didn't. Again, I'll do it again if people really like it, but if they don't, then I have no problem not doing so. So regardless of whether you did or did not particularly care for this method of review, discussion, whatever you want to call these post-episode segments and thoughts and discussion, do remember to like the video, give me a thumbs up. Some of the most recent uploads for both this and Dungeon Meshi have not been doing great in terms of likes, which has been kind of annoying to see, frankly. Remember to leave a comment, even if, obviously about the like or dislike of how I did things this time around, but also just about, any other things that I either said during this section or in the reaction itself. Check out other videos on the channel if you were so inclined to do so. I just started uploading some of my old JJK Season 2 reactions, and the first video has not performed super great thus far, which is a bit of a shame to see, but there's also, the handful of My Hero Academia Season 7 Oshinoko videos, which didn't get a ton of traction initially. And then if you want something that either is a bunch of other videos on the channel, aside from Frieren, there's the previously mentioned Dungeon Meshi videos, which is a very good series that I've been very much enjoying. With all that being said, thanks for watching. Until next time, take care. Bye-bye.